How can you be black and a Christian in a country where your oppression and the colonialist structures were all justified by Christianity in general, but in our case, justified by the Reformed tradition?
You felt that you were fighting against an enemy that was much stronger than you and had more resources than you had.
The confessing circle of the Dutch Reformed churches in South Africa was born out of a conviction in a time of injustice. They sought to proclaim the Kingship of Christ over every corner of church and state, and to stand against the machinery of apartheid. But this legacy was in danger of disappearing. Now, for the first time ever, their story is being preserved, told, and remembered.
There was a general development in South Africa that we call black consciousness. Well, black consciousness introduced the emphasis on the liberation of black people generally, and they included African, colored, Indian, and even white people that identifies with the plight of black people and the struggles of black people.
Well, the theological shift actually began in the early 1970s with the rise of the Black consciousness movement, Black theology movement, the Black power movement. It all sort of came together as a trilogy that stimulated a new kind of thinking, a new kind of ownership of theology, of theological discourse amongst ourselves. But also, of course, Black theology was a complete break with Eurocentric theology that has always been the dominant narrative in our church. And so the influence of white Dutch Reformed theological thinking on the Sending Kerk in those days was fairly heavy. And that time represented that break from that old kind of thinking.
Black consciousness also said that the indigenous communities of South Africa must become independent, mature, stand on their own feet, develop their own theology, formulate their own convictions, without necessarily being guided by white leaders, but also never apart, but in the sense of a real conversation, you know, a liberating conversation. Now, during 1974, there were a number of meetings and consultations across the country, including here. There was a minister here, Reverend Dan Kluter. He was a very, very respected person. He was also our first colored lecturer in the New Testament at the University of the Western Cape. So he started his career here. He suggested that it is necessary to find a vehicle whereby we can build a new theology, also bring together across the ethnic barriers, unite ministers initially, later also lay members, men and women, into a uniting church, into a confessing church.
So it is important for the BK to say, if the BK was fighting for church unification, but at that stage it was only the ministers of the Belydende Kring who belonged to the BK, and ordinary members was never part of that. So the Afrikaans was big in the mission church, and particularly if you think about what has happened in those days with the press, in the media. Television only started in 1976, but the radio, so Afrikaans press and media, they managed to vilify and also to demonize any church religious leaders who spoke against apartheid. So this was the sort of conditions.
Over time, the circle widened. Women stepped up, reshaping the identity of the Belydende Kring and insisting that true unity could not exist without them.
I was one of the first group of women who joined the BK, and Broeder Kring became Belydende Kring. We worked very hard as women. We also eventually formed the women's ministries to include all other women who would not feel free perhaps to be part of that without having some other people who can update them on things.
It was important for the Belydende Kring to open up its membership, because as I've said, at that stage it was only males, because there were only male ministers then, and it was only ministers who was part of the BK.
The Belydende Kring started as a predominantly male organization and dominated by theologians and ministers of the churches. But in 1983, 10 years into its existence, the name change took place. And then women realized, although we campaigned earlier about the inclusiveness of women and members of the churches, we were suddenly faced with the reality, now we are all part of it, but we have to prepare ourselves, we have to conscientize ourselves, and we have to conscientize the men. So it was a team effort. We never did anything on our own. Our motto was, together we are stronger.
Beyond South Africa, new horizons opened. Theological training in the Netherlands exposed leaders to reformed traditions that strengthened their resistance against apartheid theology.
The Netherlands experience was particularly important because, you see, the theological formation that black ministers got in South Africa at seminaries was very much designed as part of the grand apartheid project. So many of our black colleagues told us that when they studied, they were not actually forbidden, but told not to read black theology books or African theology books, but to read good Reformed theology, which meant Dutch or English or German theology translated into English for our consumption. And to have the courage to undermine apartheid theology at its roots in a radical way, it was important for black theologians, black ministers, to get a good experience of Reformed theology.
What happened was that the Bible was used by the Dutch Reformed Church to justify apartheid and to support apartheid. And the critical role that the Belydende Kring and Abrexa played was to give language to people in the church so that they can defend themselves against what we call the false theology of apartheid.
The BK could, through this scholarships at Kampen and at the Free University and also at Utrecht, help produce a series of black ministers who could beat apartheid theologians at their own game, who could think from Reformed sources and say, but Kuyper did not mean racial apartheid, even though we didn't need to agree with Kuyper. But Calvin, so drawing on the Reformed resources and rethinking, being Calvinist, being Reformed, and African, in South Africa. And Alan Busak played a huge role in that, but also other, Takatsumu King and Don Kluta and many others, Welili Mazamisa. So we were all working together at creating an African Reformed theology that would be liberating.
To me, it was a deliberate learning process in the church and conscientizing myself and becoming aware of the political situation in the country and the need to stand strong in the church.
Our conversations from the beginning of the 1970s is, can we make a distinction between a church with a confession, which we always have been, with all of the traditional confessions from the Reformed tradition? Is the difference between that and a confessing church? What does that mean theologically? What does it mean with the engagement of the situation in which we find ourselves? And so that was the conversation that ultimately led to the 1978 Synod and the quite dramatic and historic shift that the 78th Synod brought to the history of certainly the Sailing Kerk.
I would say the greatest achievement of the BK in that time was to create awareness around the issues of that time, and also promoting a vision and values that should constitute part of the future society in our country.
We had always known that if the Belydende Kring would say, what is our ideal for the future, it would be this. It would be people from across the lines, for artificial lines of race and color and culture and language and history, finding a common cause and a common vision of justice and dignity for all of South Africa's people.
You know, in South Africa, we had this stratification of first the levels of racially divided societies. And for me, as a black woman, I was at the bottom of the ladder. But BK could afford me to have meetings with people through the ladder, with racially stratified people, where we could come together regardless of their gender, their status, their educational background, their everything, where we would come together and discuss about issues that affected us all.
Years later, the story of the Belydende Kring found its way into these archives. Preserving these documents became an act of resistance in itself, ensuring that future generations would remember a community of believers who fought apartheid with conviction, courage, and faith in God.
From us who did Bantu education, the writing of stories was zero. And I thought, unless we archive these documents for the coming generations, they won't know what happened. And more so that most of our BK members were passing on. So if it doesn't get archived, in 10 years' time, nobody can talk about Belydende Kring. But if we archive this, even after 30 years, people can come and say, let me check what happened 50 years back.
3 members, or how they like to call themselves, the emeriti or the remnants of the BK, traveled to the archive. I was very blessed to work with them. But mostly, they organized the collection. They sorted everything, I explained to them what we had to do, and they were phenomenal. And they just organized everything, took charge. I just sat back, looked at them, and they did the big sort, or the first sort as we call it, and we put them in boxes. And in the meantime, we've been very systematically, up until the last finest document, we've been compiling an inventory. But it was based on their system that they implemented.
When we came to Cape Town, we started again trying to regroup also some of the things which were not yet grouped. I didn't know if it will happen. It was just a process that I said, perhaps it will happen, because in life or in a South African situation, You never tell yourself things will come to be until it comes to be. So you say, it is a process. My aim is to finish this job, but I will see how far it will go. So I don't want to lie. I didn't have this definite thing that things will be done, because I thought, what if when we come to Stellenbosch, Lizelle say no? So let me hope for the best.
There's one document that was written by the scribe of the Belydende Kring. And he starts off the letter in English with, "Dear comrades." And anyway, I enjoyed this, because this is very much the language used during apartheid as part of the struggle. And obviously, the Dutch Reformed Church and the state at that stage did not approve of communist language. So he starts the document off with, "Dear comrades," and then all the things that they need to know. But then he ends it with this verse that he quotes from, I think, the Sionsgesange, which was the hymnal book used by the Dutch Reformed Mission Church at the time. But it's in Hoog-Hollands, basically very old Dutch, which again was the language of the oppressor, but still something that they used. And it shows the diversity of the Belydende Kring and its members and the way that they work together and the different cultures meshing. So I always say you can kind of summarize the work of the Belydende Kring by, "Dear comrades, doet so voort."
Bringing it here and making it part of this place, and almost saying you're coming to rest, is saying you're coming to find a space that is logically yours. You're making it part of this reformed family. And I think that is, for me, the most amazing thing.
In general, as an archivist, we all think most stories matter, most documents matter, everything matters that are in archives, and we want to keep everything, we want to preserve history. But there is something special about preserving history when it tells a story of a group of people, brave people who fight against injustice. And the way that they fight against injustice, if you look at their documents, it was always to glorify God. And again in their statements and in their aims and in the goals and the records that they write, they talk about it's all for the glorification of God. And God is not unjust. God is a God of love.
You can't get anywhere with fighting, physical fighting, or political ways of fighting a thing. The only way to fight injustice is through the word of God. And there's no other way. There's no other way. Any other way will end up again where you started.
For them, even though they were part of the struggle, it was always not just the fight or the struggle, it was this is what God would want. And I think within that context, if you look at the anti-apartheid fight, this is in some ways a story that haven't been told, but it's also a story of bravery, of people standing up against an oppressor and fighting, but with God on their side, as they believed.
It is all our efforts is a new reconciliation that we're working towards. And that new reconciliation is breaking down not only past barriers that is located within apartheid, but breaking down all those structures that separate, that divide, that undermine, and that, it almost ensure that people are unequal. And so new reconciliation is finding that space of equality. Are we there? No. Are we getting there? I think the Belydende Kring is one of those historical institutions that have done so much in the past and can contribute to our new generation of theologians and congregations to work towards a reconciliation.